Now let's talk about calling with drawing hands on the turn. Playing drawing hands on the turn can be tricky, but if you put some thought into your decision making in these situations, these types of hands will often play themselves. There is a basic set of rules you should follow with drawing hands on the turn, a quick set of tools that will help you make sure you're making the right decision. The first thing to consider is the pot odds you're being laid at the moment. For example, if there's 3,000 in the pot and your opponent bets 1,000, your pot odds would be 1,000 to win 4,000 or 4 to 1. The 3,000 in the pot plus your opponent's bet versus the 1,000 you need to call in order to see the river card. Once you've figured out your pot odds, the next step would be to determine the odds of you catching the card you need. For example, let's say you had 4 5 of hearts and the board read King, Deuce, 9, 10 with 2 hearts. In this case, you'd need to catch one of the 9 remaining hearts in the deck out of 46 unseen cards. You already know your own 2 cards plus the 4 board cards, leaving 46 cards that you haven't seen. Of those cards, 9 are good ones and 37 are bad. So your odds of making the flush would be 37 by 9, which works out to 4.111111 to 1. So on the surface, it seems like you're getting the right price to call with your flush draw. But there are other considerations to factor in. Could your opponent have a higher flush draw? If so, that could cost you a big bet on the river. If your opponent has a set, that takes away 2 of your outs, as the 9 of hearts and 10 of hearts would no longer help you. So you have pot odds, odds of catching your hand, asking yourself if you are drawing to a winning hand or second best hand, but there is more. The next step is to ask yourself what your implied odds might be. Calculating implied odds is an inexact science, since you can never be certain what your opponent will do on the river. However, much like chess, it's important to think one move ahead and factor in your river play into the equation. Let's look at a more complex example. You have 4 6 of hearts, and the board reads King 7, 3 Queen with 2 hearts. There is 800 in the pot, and your opponent bets 600. Now you would go through the routine you see here. If there was no additional betting on the river, you should fold your hand. The pot odds are smaller than the odds of you improving your hand, so if, for example, your opponent was all in for 600, you should muck your hand. However, when you factor in the implied odds of catching a 5 or a heart, that swings things in your favor, especially if you hit the 5, since it would be a well-disguised hand that has the potential to pay off in a huge way. There is some danger here in making a losing flush that needs to also be considered, but the addition of the gut shot straight will counteract that. In these types of situations, despite the fact that you obviously know your opponent has the best hand, it's still very important to figure out what your opponent might have. You should do this on the turn, since it will help you with your little math problem, in that the strength of your opponent's hand will dictate how much you can win on the river. For example, if you think your opponent is very strong with a hand like King, Queen, or even Pocket Kings, you should be able to get paid off on a rather large bet on the river, especially if you catch the 5, where you might end up with all of his chips. On the other hand, if you think your opponent has a marginal hand, your applied odds will be diminished, since he'd be less likely to call with, say, a hand like Queen 10. So, before making the call on the turn, you need to decide how much you're going to bet on the river if you hit your hand. You should figure out what you'd bet depending on what your opponent does. As an exercise, figure out a sum for all the possible outcomes you see here. There are obviously even more scenarios that are possible, but start with these. Figure out each one, and then we'll discuss what that's done to your pot odds on the turn call. Okay, you hit the 5 and your opponent checks. If your opponent checks an innocent card like a 5, it's unlikely that he has a strong hand, which means you won't be able to make a big bet, since he'll be less likely to call. With 2,000 in the pot, a bet of about 900 sounds good. Those implied odds will change the original problem so that you're now getting a good price. 2.833 to hit your hand, 600 to win 2,300, which equals 3.83 to 1. Even if your opponent folded on the river, you would still only be making a very minor mistake on the turn by calling as a 2.8 to 1 underdog, only getting 2.3 to 1 odds on your money. Let's say you hit the 5 and your opponent bets 1,500. This is the ideal situation and the home run ball you've been waiting for. If your opponent is betting the river, there is a good chance that he's prepared to call a big re-raise, or maybe even go all in with a hand like Pocket Kings. You could raise him anywhere from 2,000 to 4,000 more, depending on how strong you feel this hand is. For this example, let's say you raised him 3,500 more. Let's take a look at what that does to your turn problem. You were a 2.8 to 1 underdog to make your draw, and the pot odds you were being laid were about 2.3. Assuming your opponent calls a river bet, that figure changes dramatically, from 2.3 to 1 to 9.667 to 1. That's a pretty sweet payday, and it could be even more if your opponent decides to go all in. Of course, if he folds for the 3,500 raise, that's not so bad either. Your investment then would have been 600 to win 2,900, or 4.8 to 1. Still a positive investment. Next example. You hit the ace of hearts and your opponent checks. This isn't a great card for you if your opponent checks the river. It's unlikely that you'll be able to call a big bet, especially if he has a hand like King Jack or Queen 10. In fact, he might not call a bet of any size with such a scary river card. With 2,000 in the pot, you don't want to bet more than half of what's in there unless you think that this will cause your opponent to think you're bluffing. Your betting history with your opponent will play a big role in how much you should be betting, but for this example, we will use 800 as a general guideline. Your opponent should still likely fold, but you don't really want to bet any less than this amount because it will hurt you in the long run to make such drastically obvious betting patterns when you want to be called. I would guesstimate that your opponent would call the 800 approximately 25% of the time, depending on the player, of course. At that rate, 3 times you'll be getting slightly the worst of it on your turn call, but 1 out of 4 times you'll be getting the best of it. That works out to 600 to win 1,600, or about 2.6 to 1. That's only a marginally bad bet for you. Okay, let's move on to the next scenario. You hit the ace of hearts and your opponent bets 1,000. This can be very tricky and is also very read dependent. Unless you have an excellent read on your opponent, knowing that he's aggressive and would bet without a flush on the river, you should lean towards just calling the bet. Raising on the river with such a small flush is a dangerous proposition since it could not only cost you valuable chips, it could also put you in a position where you allow your opponent to steal the pot from you. For example, let's say your opponent has a hand like Queen of Hearts, 10 of Spades. If you raise on the river, your opponent, knowing you can't have the nuts since he holds the key card, the Queen of Hearts, may decide to re-raise you on the river. What would you do then? Now, I'm not ruling out raising on the river as an option, but if you are going to raise with your baby flush, you better know a great deal about what your opponent is capable of. If you do raise, you could raise as little as the minimum up to maybe 2,000. The next scenario. You hit the Queen of Hearts and your opponent checks. If your opponent checks this card, chances are that he doesn't like it. Either that or he thinks you've made trips or a flush and is looking to check raise you with a full house. For all those reasons, it doesn't make sense to make a big bet in this situation. If your opponent check raises you, you'll probably be forced to fold. Also, if you bet too much, your opponent may release a hand like King 10. Once again, I would suggest a bet of approximately 800. Another scenario. You hit the Queen of Hearts and your opponent bets 2,000. Consider folding. Seriously, if your opponent makes a pot-sized bet after the Queen of Hearts hits, it's highly unlikely that he's value betting with a hand that you can beat. The bet size makes it look like he's hoping that you have a strong hand, figuring that you're forced to call. Unless you really know your opponent's tendencies, though, getting 2-to-1 odds on the river call, you should probably make the call hoping that your opponent made trip queens or is somehow running a bluff at you. There are lots of new young players in the game today that will make some wild bluffs in bizarre situations. So with a hand as strong as a flush, you'll have to keep them honest until you have more information about their game. Next, let's look at the deuce of hearts hitting the river and your opponent checking. Your opponent may be checking with a hand as strong as ace-king here, worried that you've made the flush and is happy to check and call rather than being raised on the river and put to a decision. In this case, look to get some value for your hand, betting anywhere from 1,200 to 1,600. If you choose to bet, say, 1,500 on the river and your opponent calls, your initial decision to call the 600 on the turn with your drawing hand will earn you 2,900. Since you were only a 2.8 to 1 underdog to make your hand, betting 1,500 on the river will be a profitable play, provided your opponent calls the bet, of course. Another scenario. You hit the deuce of hearts and your opponent bets 600. A 600 bet into a pot with 2,000 in it on the river usually signifies a pretty weak hand. A defensive bet hoping to keep you from betting more on the river. As always, you need to really understand your opponent in these types of situations in order to make the best play available. Folding is out of the question. Calling is the safest play, but you should probably try getting some value out of this hand by making a raise that's not too big to scare your opponent off, while at the same time not so big that it puts a huge dent in your stack. Raising to 1,500 or 1,600 is probably about the right amount. So as you can see, there is more to making a turn call than simply figuring out the current pot odds. Your perceived implied odds can turn what seems to be a long shot draw into a very profitable play under the right circumstances. If there's one street in Hold'em where you should take your time and think it through, it's the turn. Not only are you thinking about the bet you're currently facing, but you should also be one step ahead, thinking about what you'll do on the river.